I think that people like Ryan Pineda are doing it right.
Yeah.
Where it's just like, keep putting stuff out. And if you're giving value in every single video.
Right.
Because you can't just put stuff out just for the sake of putting it out. There has to be something there that's worth sharing.
Why are people following type of thing? Because you never like, well, no, I take that back. You did pick a niche. You went like wrestling, right? Because you came directly from red carpet hosting.
But I was always doing some wrestling interviews.
Okay.
It was just like, I would do a celebrity interview and then the wrestling fans would go, what the heck? Like, I didn't know this person was in WWE. Ha ha ha.
Yeah.
And then I would do a wrestling interview. And then the people that had come for all those celebrity interviews were like,
who's this?
Yeah, exactly. So it really just came down to, I love talking to people. You know, I love having interesting conversations with interesting people.
Right.
And when you work as an entertainment reporter and a TV host, you get to talk to everybody.
Yeah.
Like I was talking to actors and comedians and directors and some pro wrestlers, some athletes. It's like, everybody has an amazing story.
Sure.
I want to talk to everybody. But with the access I had to wrestling before there was as many podcasts as there are now, there's a lot of podcasts now and a lot of YouTube channels now. But when I was really starting this in like 2011, 2012, when I was doing these pro wrestling interviews, nobody else had this access. So I was just like, I'm going to take it and run with it.
Sure. Yeah. Do you feel like that chained you to a certain industry for a period of time where you maybe didn't like it as much or felt like you were almost like contained to a bubble?
It's interesting now. Like I just posted an interview with Gerard Butler from the other day.
Okay.
Where I interviewed Ron Howard last month, Margot Robbie last month. It's so interesting because there's so many people that just know me for the wrestling interviews.
Yeah.
And I get it. You know, those interviews have got millions and millions of views on my YouTube channel. And I'm super grateful for that.
And that's such a specific audience, right? Like the wrestling fans, like I'm a wrestling fan.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
And they'll be like, oh my God, my man CVV's doing big things. He got an interview with Margot Robbie. It's like, well, actually, that's my third interview with her. but thank you.
Yeah, right.
It's just amazing when like I'll post an old photo of like me with Steven Spielberg or something.
Yeah.
And people are like, I can't believe you got, can't believe these things are happening for you. It's like, no, this is what I've always done.
Yeah.
It's just, I took that niche. I kind of saw some white space there that nobody else was doing it.
Yeah.
And I just kind of ran with it. Because up until that point, of course, actors are going to be promoting their movies. Of course, directors are promoting their movies. Comedians are promoting their tours. Athletes are promoting their books or whatever it happens to be. It really took a very specific type of person to have an in-depth interview with pro wrestlers back then. Because for the most part,
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
For the most part, they're going to the local morning show to just simply promote that Raw or SmackDown.
Right. They got 3 minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they would be like, so we've got John Kenna here. I hear we can't see you. Anyway. All right. And I would like get someone like an early one, like Jeff Hardy.
Yeah.
And I would be like, I used to do a swanton bomb in the year 2000 onto my friends and be like, no way, man. That's like immediately you connect.
Sure. Yeah.
So I had this ability from like being a wrestling fan for most of my life.
Yeah. Right.
Of being able to connect with massive stars in the pro wrestling space that like when I would bring in these people into the TV station, my boss was like, hey, Chris, we got to cool it on the wrestlers for a little while. Like,
interesting.
Nobody knows who this person is outside of wrestling fans.
Yeah, right. Is that what kind of prompted you to do your own thing?
It was more of just like the wrestling was really growing. Like, and I had a tremendous amount of access in 2018 into 2019. It was a really exciting time in pro wrestling with the advent of AEW coming in as a competitor. WWE hadn't had a real competitor that was on cable television for 20 years since WCW got bought by WWE in 2001. So like this hadn't happened.
Yeah.
So it was just like, I had a lot of real momentum that was happening. And any of my wrestling interviews were getting hundreds of thousands of views on my YouTube channel. So it was just kind of like, all right, I saw that this was starting to happen. I also saw that like I was getting a lot more opportunities in, call it, new media with like the influencer space.
Yeah.
And I wasn't allowed to do a lot of that stuff with my TV job. And I was just like, how many more opportunities am I leaving on the table because of this really great job that I have in TV? And I'm super grateful for this job, but how many other opportunities am I leaving on the table?
Totally.
And I just started to kind of weigh them out and went, if I'm already getting this many subscribers, this many views on this content that I'm doing in my spare time.
Right.
What would happen if I put a little bit more effort
Did it
into
full time, right?
And that was really where it began.
What year was that?
2019.
Oh, wow. So that was very recent then.
And it was almost like I saw the writing on the wall, because the guy who ended up taking my job, he was loving it. And then the world shut down, and the show that we were both on, he is still on, kind of had to be paused because, you know, who wants to hear about entertainment news when who knows what's going on in the world right now?
Right.
So it was almost like I without even knowing it, I picked a great time to get out, because that wouldn't have been as fun.
That's pretty wild that, like, I mean, you got started so early though. If you're talking about 2011, 2012, that like the station, I feel like now, my point is, I feel like now, if you're working at a TV station and they're providing a lot of these opportunities where, you know, you're using kind of like the force of media to be able to land interviews with this person, and you're just kind of privately putting them on a YouTube channel. Like, I don't think that now, now they would be like, yeah, we own that. And you.
In 2007, I was working on a show called 969 for MTV2 in Canada.
Okay.
And we were doing massive celebrity interviews, massive musician interviews. And this was like very early in the YouTube days. And I was like, man, I did these interviews that I'm really proud of, that unless you happen to be watching that channel, that exact time on that exact day, you never would have saw my interviews with these people. And I'm like, that kind of sucks, because I'm pretty proud of it.
Right.
So I was ripping these interviews from our website. So they would put up the interviews on our website in like a not great quality.
Sure.
I would rip them,
because nothing was good quality back then.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
I was ripping them from there, and I put them on this kind of like, I put them on a YouTube, like a burner YouTube account that still exists to this day with like a terrible username. But I would put them on there because I'm like, I just want other fans of this band to see this conversation where like I got this little nugget.
Right.
And I remember my co-host being like, hey, I'm also doing that thing on this other burner account. I'm like, yes, like, let's get our stuff out there. And it was the idea of like, we just wanted it to be seen by people. Yeah. This was before you could monetize things on YouTube. It was just the idea of like, I just wanted more people to see this.
Yeah.
Because that old school model of broadcasting is so funny that unless you are, number one, turn on the TV. Number two, tune it to this channel.
Right.
Number three, you have to be watching that show at that time.
At the time. Right. Exactly.
Whereas now, if you want to go down a rabbit hole on YouTube and watch Foo Fighters just playing Learn to Fly for the next 24 hours, you can.
Right.
That didn't really exist back then.
It's wild that we're even saying the words back then. This was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's not that's what gets me excited about the future of like podcasting or YouTube. Cause you know, obviously we help a lot of people start podcasts and do what you and I do. And one of the biggest questions I get still is like, isn't it too saturated? Yeah. Isn't it like, there's too many out there, right? It's like, well, no, like look at the evolution of television. You know, when television first came on, there was like what, 4 channels? Yeah. You know what I mean? Like there was the barrier to entry was massive. The people that were on TV were basically as famous as the people that were on movies because there was 30 million televisions in the US and they all got 3 options to choose from. It was either I watch this show tonight, this show tonight, or this show tonight, or I read or listen to the radio. Yeah. You know what I mean? There wasn't social media and TikTok and Netflix and Disney Plus and this movie and that movie and all these other libraries of TV shows from the past 40 years of production to choose from. It was 3. You get this one, or this one, you know, like now we're at that stage, but in a new form of media that will always constantly be growing and changing over the next 20, 30, 40 years. That'll wipe out an old existing form of media.
And I think that we're still very much in the early stages of this, like very, very much in the early stages of this.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of creators that are fearful to jump into the deep end of podcasting because they think that you need to be as big as Joe Rogan or Smartless or any number of those massive podcasts. And the reality is you could make a really good living on this with an audience that's a 10th or 1/100th of the size of those big shows.
Absolutely. Especially because, so in YouTube advertising, right? So YouTube essentially owns all the content that you put out there, meaning that like you're not the one going and monetizing that content more often than not, right? Some creators do different deals where they'll do organic content for people. And I understand that there's other brand deals to be had, but in terms of like sponsorship revenue, Google basically goes, hey, we'll pay you X amount of dollars per advertising dollar that we make. And they make a ton of money in ad dollars. So they pay you depending on the niche or the type of creation that you're doing, the type of audience that you have. They pay you what, $3 to $6 CPM or something like that?
If you're lucky.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Whereas in podcasting, you set the price. You either find an agency to work with or you go pitch sponsors yourself, and you can make $25 to $45 CPM on a podcast.
You got to do the work there.
You do have to go do the work. That is the difference.
Finding out about YouTube AdSense, YouTube AdSense. I remember finding out about that like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
My friend said, "Oh, how much money are you making from those videos you're posting?" I'm like, "What do you mean? What do you mean money?
Tell me more."
Yeah. Like I said, I'm just doing it so people can like see these interviews and see this content. He goes, "Oh yeah, there's this thing called AdSense. If you just go in there, you click a few buttons, and once you reach $100, they'll pay you out." I said, "Are you kidding me?"
Yeah.
So I've been like, this has existed the whole time. Like, yeah. So I clicked the button, and it was within like 2 months that I had reached that $100 threshold. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
It's like free money.
Literally.
So the cool thing about that is you don't have to put in any effort to find the advertisers.
Right. You focus on creating, and that's it.
And that's a great thing. And I think that what's difficult sometimes with podcasts is you've got to sell somebody on buying that ad space. Then you've got to really show some results or else they're not going to buy again.
Yeah.
Whereas YouTube's just going to go, "Oh, those ads didn't work for your channel. We'll just try these ads instead."
Here's one of the other 3 million people that are buying ads on channels like yours. Yeah. That is fair. That is fair. But the point being that you don't have to get 100 million downloads or 100 million YouTube views to be able to make that type of money.
I think that's really where this creator culture is really heading. Like you mentioned niching down. I really think that like if you have 70,000 subscribers, 7,000 followers on whatever platform it happens to be, and you are so hyper dialed into whatever 100%. Your topic is, that is so much more valuable than someone that has 700,000 subscribers.
Right. And even, especially for the advertisers, because you have to think of it. You have to put your mind into the perspective of an ad buyer at one of these massive companies. If they can buy ads on Joe Rogan, if they have the ad budget to buy ads on Joe Rogan, they're just going to buy ads on Joe Rogan. If you're doing a Joe Rogan-esque podcast that's anything about anything and you have 400 downloads, they're not going to take the time to give you $43 to advertise in front of your audience. However, I'll give you a perfect example, dude. My buddy Harry Duran, shout out to Harry. He's had a podcast for a while called Podcast Junkies, and he just interviews podcasters. So he's just, big time loves the podcast industry. And Harry recently started a podcast about vertical farming. I don't know the title. I literally, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it's the Vertical Farming Podcast. I think that is the name of it. So he starts this thing on vertical farming, which I didn't even know was a thing until he's like recounting the story to me, telling me like, "Oh yeah, I started this thing on vertical farming." I was like, "On what now?" Like, what is that?
I don't know what that is.
You know what I mean? So apparently there's this whole sub-market or industry of people that are into this like farming vertically, and they build this whole little thing. But there's all these things to know about it because you have to get the plants to grow this way, and you got to use this type of whatever humidifier or I'm talking out of my ass right now, but this entire industry that focuses around vertical farming. He starts his podcast. His first 2 seasons, he secured over $70,000 in sponsorship revenue for like 24 episodes for a show that gets, if I had to guess, less than 500 downloads an episode. Like, I don't know the actual number. It's just that, like, if you think about it again from that advertiser perspective, it's like this company clearly knows that the people who have this as a hobby are willing to spend money to buy the best equipment. It's like an audiophile, right? You can buy a speaker that's $100 off of Amazon, or you can buy a speaker that's $25,000 from Sennheiser or something like that. And some people will do that because it's their hobby. They love doing it that much. Vertical farming is this random space that exists exists where people just have money to spend on this hobby that happens to cost a good amount of money. Well, these advertisers, they need a way to get the word out about the message that they have, and they're not going to buy ads on Joe Rogan. They're not going to buy ads on Facebook. They're not going to buy ads on Google because the audiences are way too broad. It's like, how do you target somebody with a vertical farming interest on Google or Facebook? Google may be a little bit better because it's search-based, search intent-based. But definitely Facebook and Instagram and like some of these massive shows with huge numbers, just like why would we waste money advertising to people who have no idea what we do and have zero interest in buying anything that we have to offer? Yeah. So they're like, we have this ad budget and we want to go acquire customers, but we don't know where to spend the money. You know what I mean? So it's like vertical farming podcast Harry comes over and goes, hey, I got people who are very interested in vertical farming. Yeah. So he secures $70,000. They fly him, one of the CEOs of the company that's sponsoring him flies him to Dubai for a week to speak at this, or host like a panel and be a moderator of a panel with these other vertical farming industry, CEOs or whatever. And he was like, bro, it was the weirdest thing. I was at this conference and like people were coming up to me being like, Harry, you're the guy that, it's just like, he was like this literal micro celebrity in this random space of vertical farming in Dubai and got the whole thing paid for, comped. He was paid and he got 70,000 in sponsorships from talking about vertical farming. You know what I mean? And that's exactly what you and I are talking about. It's like, you don't have to go to this super broad audience and become the next Joe Rogan to be able to make enough money to like stop working your shitty job at whatever, fill in the blank, Starbucks or the mill or the warehouse down the road, unloading ice at Michael's or whatever you do. You know what I mean? Like there are other options where you can create these like this really cool living doing something, talking about something you actually give a shit about that can help connect you to more interesting people, take you across the world to different places. It's just like that's going to be the next phase. Sure.
The biggest thing within that is if you treat podcasting like a hobby, it will be a hobby.
It pays you like a hobby.
If you treat podcasting like a business, it will start to pay you like a business. Yep. I think there's too many people that will record 1 or 2 episodes, take a week off because life got too crazy, pick it back up in 3 weeks. Your audience is not going to show up when you do that. Mm-hmm. I think that you need to make the commitment to your audience that you're going to show up every Monday or every Monday and Wednesday or whatever it happens to be. Then your audience is going to start to show up for you.
Yep.
And I think that that's the biggest thing. Sure, I say this all the time. The best thing about podcasting is anybody can do it. The worst thing about podcasting is anybody can do it and there's no barrier of entry. If you are going to get in, I think you need to fully commit to actually doing it.
Yeah, right.
Like, you can't just go, man, me and my friends are funny, so let's just hit record and do this thing. Right. We love talking about the Maple Leafs.
Yeah.
So let's make this
the Bengals.
Yeah.
Let's drink beer and talk about the Bengals.
Yeah.
Once every 4 months when we all have the time to sit down.
Space all the time.
That's got to be proliferating in that space.
Especially because like everybody has a take about anything, and I get that. I love that.
Sure.
That's one of the best things about the internet.
Right.
Just because everybody has a take doesn't mean that everybody needs to put their take out there.
Right. Doesn't mean it's valuable.
Especially in the world of wrestling where there's rumors all the time. Like people will be like, this person said this thing. They must be true.
Yeah. Right.
It's interesting that like anybody can start it, but can you continue doing it?
Totally.
And I think that finding your niche, that's a big thing that we always hear people talking about is like, find your niche. Well, that's a difficult thing. Mm-hmm. But once you do find your niche, once you do find that thing that you're passionate about, it is easier now more than ever to become an expert in that thing.
Right.
Like within 18 months, if you picked something today and you started a podcast, maybe you even wrote a book about it.
Yeah.
And then you started putting out like videos, like where you're talking directly to the camera about it. Within 18 months and you're speaking on stages, you could be the expert or one of the experts on that thing. If that was your topic and your niche and you stuck to it.
Absolutely. If you would just commit to something and do it for a while. You know, it's always the underestimation of work is what gets me, especially in podcasting specifically. And especially because we talk to a lot of business owners. So I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs that are used to like, hey, if we pull this lever, we know that we can get this much out of this thing, you know, and they're like, and they come to the podcast space expecting to do the same thing. And these are people who've built and sold companies that are 9 figures, like people who are independently wealthy that have a ton of money, a ton of knowledge to share and valuable insights. And they can't come in and buy their way into being famous immediately. Yeah. It's just going to take time, and it frustrates some people, but it's just it's almost I was talking to Jordan Harbinger about this. It's like the great equalizer is like, not every celebrity who starts a podcast is destined to be really successful with it. There's been a lot of celebrities who you'd think are coming into space and just like, oh, they're going to be huge. 6 months later, they fizzle out because they didn't get the results they wanted.
I think a lot of that though is like, who's backing it, right?
Sure.
And who's producing it? Is it even a good concept to begin with? Because just because you have a former president hosting a podcast doesn't mean it's going to be great.
Right.
But we're now starting to see that when Spotify creates a podcast and puts the machine of Spotify behind it, and every time anybody's opening up their app and they're seeing that that's a new podcast, and those pop-ups now, like you open up Spotify and there's a pop-up about a podcast you've never heard of. It's like, I see what you're doing here.
They've turned it into a science for sure.
They know.
Yeah, but even they miss a lot. Yeah. You know, I was reading something recently where they like eliminated this entire like division of their content arm that was producing a bunch of new shows, and they canceled all the new shows and fired a bunch of people in that division. And it was just, even then it was a realization for me that was like, even a company with basically unlimited funding and probably more data on podcasts than anybody else in the world, even they aren't going to create a show and have it like, it's not an exact science.
Well, they're not all home runs.
Right.
It's the same way when you make a television program.
Exactly.
Like, not every TV program gets past the pilot.
Right.
Not everyone gets renewed for a second season. And I think it's the same with podcasting.
Totally.
You take enough swings, eventually you're going to hit a home run.
It's just that if you don't ever get started, you know what I mean? It's not just going to happen on accident. And it's not going to happen after 3 episodes.
I get those messages all the time. It's like, I want to do this. What's the best advice you have for me? It's like, well, just do it.
Yeah.
Like, actually start.
The big thing, dude, is the commitment.
Yes.
It's a friend of mine, Eric Sue. I don't know if you know Eric. He's co-host of the Marketing School podcast with Neil Patel. And they do well. They get, I don't know, 1 million plus downloads a month or something like that. And I was reading something that he wrote out the other day, and it basically said that. He was like, if you're doing anything in content, expect the minimum of 3 years before you have enough to go off of to figure out what the next iteration is going to be. Like 3 years is the number. And I was like, that's even a little bit farther, like more than I typically recommend to people.
Wow, 3 years is a lot.
But I think what he's really talking to is people who've never done anything in content or communication or hosting or speaking or any of those things. You're developing multiple skills at once. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't just like come in and be really good at it. And if you can, you'll probably have faster results than other people because you have maybe a natural ability to, you know, be maybe more charismatic or whatever. But for most people, you're starting at the base. You're starting from scratch on day one, where it's like, you don't know how to be a successful podcaster or YouTuber, but also you don't know how to interview somebody. You don't know how to ask somebody to be a guest on your show. You don't know how to communicate with that person. You don't know how to ask good questions. You don't know how to prepare for an interview. You don't know how to, like, there's so many skills that you don't currently have that are preventing you from doing this. So when you're looking at it and going like, I'll give it like a couple months, you know, like I'll throw a couple episodes out there, see what happens. It's like, I'll tell you what happens. Save yourself the time. I will tell you, like, you know what I mean? Like, I'll predict your future right now. It's not going to work. It is the development of that skill set and craft over time. Which is why, like, we talked about this before, but that's why I think, like, you stepped into the podcast and YouTube world and you did well. And it not trying to take anything away from the hard work that you had after you started, but you put in like a freaking decade of work before you started. Hosting, asking good questions, figuring out how to elicit responses from people that get asked questions all the time. Like, that's a real skill set.
I'll tell you the thing that really escalated my YouTube channel was I was willing to do things that other people weren't willing to do. I was willing to drive to go do an interview. I was willing to fly and pay for my own flight, my own hotel to go do an interview. All I needed was someone to say yes. I would reach out to someone. All I needed was them to say yes. And I go, great. Well, now I got to find my way to Phoenix. I got to somehow, get to Las Vegas.
Yep.
And that was a big thing, especially before Zoom interviews were even a thing.
Right.
I hadn't done an interview virtually before the pandemic.
Oh, really? Wow.
Not one.
Wow.
And I put a tweet out like the first week of the pandemic in March of 2020. And I said, guys, never done a virtual interview before. What do you suggest? And I had a lot of people throwing out suggestions. I ended up, Zoom kind of
Sure.
was kind of place where everyone was.
Yeah. Flocking.
Yeah, exactly. It was easy. Right. But up until that point, they were all done in person.
That's wild.
I was driving 5 hours. This is one where like I got a scoop with Chris Jericho. I drove 5 hours to do this interview. I was editing it on the way back on my laptop as my buddy was driving, and then the laptop died. We pulled over to a service station to plug it back in to finish the export.
Yeah.
Like that was the type of stuff I was doing. And I think that now there's a lot of podcasters that are so conditioned to just, here's a Zoom link.
Totally. Yeah. 100%, dude.
Those conversations aren't the same.